Science Confidently Uncertain, a show where two Army vets turned renewable energy engineers discuss veteran issues, science, geopolitics, and everything in between. I'm your host, Pearson Guest, and I'm joined as always by my co-host, Richard Ellis. How's it going today, Richard?
Good morning, Pierce.
All right, awesome. So today we're going to be kicking off the second half of Polyvagal Theory. But first, we normally cover good news, but since we have so much to do, we have a little bit of housekeeping instead. So first, I wanted to talk a little bit about our video versus our recording. So some of our listeners probably are listening via in their car or headset or something like that, and they're not watching the video. And during the video, we do post corrections to maybe things we say off the cuff. And we are talking off the cuff. Richard, I think you wanted to kind of talk a little bit about that, even though we have slides and we are trying to research this stuff as best we can.
Yeah, I'm speaking extemporaneously about these topics and trying to make them relatable. And you know, I have this one PhD's name half remembered, and we have this one biological fact partly remembered, and we just want to let everybody know that if we come up with something that is kind of almost correct or partially true or partially remembered, yeah, that sometimes that's the result of speaking extemporaneously. And so when we catch those things, we try to correct them on the video file on YouTube. So if you hear something that sounds like, it's false or like we didn't know what we were talking about, we might not have, but we probably figured it out later.
Yeah, we'll always try to make corrections. I think, for instance, the last video on addiction, we were talking the first part of polyvagal theory, which if you guys haven't checked it out, you should totally do so. Um, we were talking about brains and the multi parts of brains within the human. You were explaining that it was almost as if we had five different brains within this one brain, and I mentioned octopus having something like eight, but it was nine. So I posted that on the video, and if you were listening, you never got to see me correct myself. Also, we are adding links into the description as we go for the news articles and the things and some of the information we try to find. We try to post as many links in the description as we can. I'm trying to get better at that. Time is limited, but hopefully we'll get better and better about doing that as well. Is there any other housekeeping we have?
I'm sure something will come up as we're going.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. If you are watching the video, you might notice my wife made me actually get rid of all my grays in my beard. So she was like, I can't stand looking at your scraggly beard. So she made me clean this up. So I might look one tone younger now. Very, very nice.
Yeah, you have to be about 10 years older, Pierce, before the gray starts to really look refined and, sophisticated.
It's funny. I had a lot more grays when I got out of the Army, and
Mm-hmm.
they went away when I was out. Like they just started to, some of them just went away. I mean, I still had some of them that stay, especially in the beard. Like if you guys want to be able to tell, and you can see in the first couple videos, I have a whole like gray army coming out in one side. Um, but yeah, a lot of those grays just disappeared with the stress of the military fading into the background. That was kind of an interesting phenomenon.
There's So speaking extemporaneously and getting most of the facts wrong or sideways, there's a concept in aging where it's been found that telomeres are the part of our genetic makeup that kind of they're like the aglets at the end of your shoelaces. That's how I've heard them described. So they keep the shoelace from unraveling. And telomeres prevent our DNA from becoming unmethylated, or rather from detangling, basically. It's in the most oversimplified description. And, you and I were living lives of high stress environments with poor co-regulation or none at all, and in a chronic state of stress. And that will absolutely cause our age clock to hasten faster than our actual chronological age
Yeah.
and result in gray hair.
Yes, and we've seen, and there's memes going around about Gen X looking old, millennials looking older, Gen Z is complaining about how old they look already, which is funny. So,
it's, that's as much a product of marketing as it is the actual consequence of stress and the way our civilization works. If you
that's
look at pictures of the two preceding generations before us, maybe three preceding generations before us, these people look old even in their 20s. So, it's
oh God, yeah, I see kids like return. I mean, Labor Day, the kids back then who are working and already part of unions, being forced into
yeah,
unions, 11-year-olds, they look like they were 30, had kids
yeah.
and a family. So yeah.
Archie Bunker was the platonic ideal of a man in his 60s, and he was in his 40s when All in the Family started. So,
So he
you
would have
know,
been, yeah, he was, yeah, a young millennial now, I guess, or an old millennial, or a young Gen Xer, or
essentially my age when he started All in the Family, and very much was what could be taken as a man much older, maybe 20 years older than he was.
gosh, that's funny. Well, on that, let's jump right back into polyvagal and the slides we were at. Should we do a little recap uh,
Yeah.
for the people who didn't get to listen to the first episode yet of this part?
Yep. Since we always have to assume that we're being listened to out of order. The polyvagal theory is sort of a science of safety. This idea of the science of safety in the way that human beings experience that. Polyvagal theory can be understood as a science of safety. The theory provides us with a physiological and psychological understanding of our autonomic nervous system. Autonomic meaning automatic, or the thing that's running without our conscious control and intervention. It speaks to how we move through states of energy mobilization, engagement, and disconnection. It helps us understand how our experience of safety and connection are directly shaped by our experiences from infancy, childhood, and adulthood. When our autonomic nervous system is functioning well, it helps us to manage the daily challenges and stressors of life by shifting our physiological state. Ideally, we shift in and out of our different nervous system states like stress and challenge. So, sympathetic nervous system arousal is what we would bring online in the event of challenges. With relative ease, and our system is resilient enough to come back to regulated states of well being and social connection. And that last piece there is actually one of the most important ideas that I think you and I will constantly touch on and might maybe never actually really get into the granularity of. It fits into this model of response flexibility, which is to say that we have enough nervous system resiliency that we can move through these different states of being, of activation or disconnection or being socially mobile, and it's not, each of those transitions is not some alternating trauma for us, or that we can do so in a way that's effective and meaningful for our health and well-being. And
Yes, and if
so
I
it's
may, to
mm-hmm,
add to that, I so when we're talking about this, and I think you're right. If we don't tackle it directly, we will be around the periphery. My running theory of everything is a sine wave, and that your own signal, ideally should be a sine wave, and a
mm-hmm,
robust one at that. And what you're talking about, this resilient signal, this robust signal, um, it can undergo plenty of disturbance and agitation and still
mm-hmm,
maintain, a relatively pure signal. It might lose a tick of in its frequency of hertz or something like that along the way, but it's relatively robust. And I think generally with the polyvagal theory, what it's tackling is that if you're a highly traumatized individual who hasn't addressed that trauma
mm-hmm,
healthily and healed from that, then your signal is not a sine wave. It's static. It's very jagged up and down. You could see a lot of
Yeah.
extreme highs, potentially and extreme lows. And so it's really hard to balance. And any disturbance can really,
Yeah.
I mean, it's already a messed up signal. And so it will provide a I'll provide a couple graphics on screen for visual aid to kind of show what we're talking about here. But I think that's what we're talking about is a robust signal versus what we're getting into is the not so robust signal, and where I've
Yeah.
seen my signal change a lot over from my adult life to pre-army to post-army to now. So yeah, I think that's kind of my little add to that portion there.
Response flexibility is a term that's not really fully incorporated into the discussion of. If you look up polyvagal theory and look at anything that's been written about it, not really anybody's saying response flexibility. That's coming from a different conceptual basis, but it fits. And it fits because it means that we are attuned to our central nervous system, excuse me, our autonomic nervous system's states. So we can check in and notice, oh, I'm feeling in this moment, I'm feeling maybe apprehensive because the situation is tense, or in this moment, I'm feeling dysregulated or disconnected, or maybe I'm checking out or disassociating. And to be able to notice that, and then to be able to adjust our breathing or to maybe engage in some co-regulating behavior with someone, and then bring ourselves back into that in socially engaged and relaxed state. There's this other terminology called prosaic voice or prosodic, I think is the way it's pronounced. So a prosodic voice is one where we would hear different intonations. So it's not the classic monotone of Ben Stein, teaching that class in that movie from the '80s that I'm forgetting, whatever it was. But that
Ferris
that
Bueller.
monotone, yeah, probably, I think it was Ferris Bueller. And so it's not just Ben Stein's monotone. That's actually really upsetting to us. But a prosodic voice is when we would have a quiet moment, we would have a slightly more loud moment. We're not screaming ever, but the voice modulation is much more like song than it is like monotone.
It's dynamic. It's
Yeah.
yeah, there's potentially rhythm change, or there's high
Hmm.
notes, there's lower notes. Yeah, there's a melody to it. I understand what you're saying.
Polyvagal theory gets so deep into the idea of what co-regulation means and what our central nervous system responds to that the authors actually talk about the muscles in our inner ear and the adjustments that our inner ear makes when our autonomic nervous system is activated into sympathetic fight flight mode. And this is really interesting because it addresses something that I would say a pretty large proportion of vets with PTSD suffer from, which is some type of auditory problems. Auditory sensitivity to loud noises, auditory sensitivity to having difficulty hearing people in like
Noisies,
crowded and
like a lot of ambient noise.
yep,
So one
crowded noisy places
Yeah, or even your house gets noisy. You know, you have two
mm-hmm,
or three kids running around, all
yep.
being kids, which they're loud, by the way. If you don't have kids yet, they're really loud. They scream all the time. You can't tell them to shut up. They're just going to be loud. So you, that that's part of it. That's a baseline. Then you have like
Yeah,
TV in the background as some kind
yeah,
of white noise, and then you and your wife are trying to have a conversation, talk about
yeah,
anything. Hey, what do I need to get from the grocery store? Wait, what did you say? Did you say,
yeah,
oh, don't forget what? And it's always like you just miss, and there's all this noise can cause a lot
yeah,
of stress. Like you can be, and there were moments, definitely 4 years ago, 3 years ago, where just all the noise, I would get really overwhelmed really easily with a bunch of different
yeah,
noise. And it like this wasn't from any experience while I was in the service or anything like that. It was just that stressed me out before then either. It was just too many different noises, and I'm trying to concentrate on something. I could just get really, yeah, usually pissed off. Like everybody
So,
shut up.
so two things. So one, the shape change in our inner ear, which is a autonomic nervous system trait, is theorized to give us better acuity for hearing low frequency sounds, as opposed to prosodic sounds coming from human voices. And so maybe we're listening for growling noises or the fall of the footsteps or the movement of leaves. It's like these potentially natural sounds that would indicate that we were being stalked or in some other way in a natural form of danger. But when our co-regulation state or our co-regulation brings us into the green state, for example, or a state of relaxation and pro-social behavior, then it would change the shape of our inner ear muscles, and then we would be attuned to listening for prosodic sounds
Yeah.
and engaging with music or human voices or that type of thing. And the second part of this is that, as you were saying, it's like in the science of automation, we can talk about positive and negative feedback systems. And a positive feedback system takes a value from an output. Let's say we have a box here, and that box is a process. It takes a value from the output, brings it back around, and puts it back into the input, and then adds to it again. That's a positive feedback loop. And what's happening in our nervous systems is that we're positively feedback. Okay, it's hard to hear what your spouse is saying, and what you're doing is trying to listen, and the kids are screaming, and the TV is on, and there's an emergency vehicle going by in the street, and sirens on, and the next thing you know, if you're me, you're screaming at everybody to shut the F up, because I just need to hear this one thing from my wife's sing-songy voice, because she's not stressed out by all these things. Totally normal for her. Yeah, this is absolutely the plight of the veterans' autonomic nervous system, but not just the vets. This is the plight of the nervous system of a person whose sensitivity to threat and lack of safety is their modality of life. And that's people who have been traumatized. That's people with either complex trauma, which is of long duration, and chronic nervous system threat, or single or maybe isolated instances of threat and feelings of unsafety.
Yeah.
So go ahead.
It's funny. I had a discussion with my mom recently where she's been listening and it's been triggering childhood memories for her. And one of severe abandonment that I don't think she fully remembers that well, but where, it, it was a very broken up story because I think she was 5 or 6 when it happened, and she's remembering it now, where she had like traveled across the country with her father. They were moving to this new house, and they just moved in, and she remembers going to the bathroom, and the floor was full of roaches, and she just froze and didn't call out for anybody because I don't know, at the time she knew no one would come to help her. And I was like, "You were left home alone?" She's like, "No, I had this feeling like no one's gonna come and help me anyways."
Yeah.
And I was like, "Holy when she told me that, I was like, "Whoa, that feeling of abandonment." And I was like, it's interesting because an extreme moment of abandonment. I mean, for a child, right? Roaches all over the floor, you're freaking out. It's a scary thing.
And if you want to diagram what you're describing, she went into that parasympathetic freeze response, and it's connected to the injury of attachment that occurred early in her development.
Yeah.
So I want to tag what you're describing as like we now have the narrative of these natural histories to be able to describe them and understand how you could get a freeze reaction or a agitated reaction that's either
Yeah.
fighting something or running away. And freezing is something we'll get into with my slides today.
So what was crazy to me is she was talking about that moment being traumatic, but what it indicated was that there was, like you said, trauma before that that
Yeah.
caused her to have that feeling, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And what's crazy is realized when she moved in with her friend recently. She's moving into a new apartment, so she moved into her friend's house during the move. Um, and she said she felt very safe at that house, and so these memories started to come out,
Mm-hmm.
and also while listening to us discuss these things. And I was like, oh wow. And she's like, I hadn't felt that feeling of, I felt like I was safe with my friend and that there was this feeling of safety. And I was like, oh wow. And so this was just a recent discussion and really interesting. What the one point I wanted to make, which I thought was interesting, is when I'm writing about my past, sometimes I wish there would have been like just an incident, right? Like, hey, this is what happened. This is the trauma that
Yeah.
happened, and like it might have been extreme and severe, but then you have like that thing to point out. But when I'm writing, I'm realizing mine was like it was so incremental. It was just every day in, day out. And you can, I know,
Yeah.
can relate to this too, this constant feeling of oppression, right? Like that
Mm-hmm.
feeling like I have dictators they're dictating my life. And they're very strict. The rules are changing. So that's a fun game too.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and you might think you're playing the best way of their rules, but you're not, because the rules are changing,
Yeah.
and what they value is different than what you value, and you're not identifying what they value well. like that, like you're not getting it yet. And I was just thinking like incremental like complex trauma versus like just, hey, I
Yeah.
was beaten regularly by my, that it would have been, I felt like it almost would have been easier if my dad had beaten me more. It's like, not to say I wasn't spanked and, hit for certain things or
Yeah.
whatever, but like it almost feels like that would have been easier sometimes. I don't know if that makes sense, but I don't have a better way of describing it. But that was the thoughts that were sparked when my mom was talking about it, and the incrementalism versus the extreme. Yeah.
Yeah, so I have two things to reply to you with that, and that is that uh, if you're a person who lived through the type of trying experience that Pierce and I talk about here, and you want to start working on it, and for example, you find yourself in a therapeutic situation or a co-regulated relationship or some type of scenario where you can let your guard down, what that inevitably will do, and what the people who use polyvagal theory and the safe and sound protocol, which is related to that, what they find is that there are clients that they work with who the minute that treatment begins to work, they lock right back up again. And it is because that is the way that our nervous system works, where if we're beginning to loosen up a little bit, then it it sets in motion a cascade of okay, threat neuroception. I actually don't feel safe, despite the fact that all the cues would tell me that I am, because of all the injuries and re-injuries of the past. So that's the paradoxical nature of this, that a actual feeling of legitimate safety will then awaken and release uh, memories of something that was very upsetting that took place in the past that is totally below our cognition or awareness most of the time. And the other part of this is so the second thing I wanted to mention is um, I think that there will always be a little bit of a who's got the bigger trauma measuring contest when this type of topic comes up. And I want to acknowledge that Janina Fisher has a definition, Bessel van der Kolk has a definition. Pete Walker has everybody that we ever reference in this discussion, they have their definitions, and they all sort of have a they're a gemstone of many facets. They kind of all are the same thing, but every time you look at a different site, you get a different idea. And that is to say that um, a a a traumatic experience, and particularly those of chronic trauma, are those where our nervous system perceived that we were in some kind of danger that was life threatening or threatening to our health and safety. And a experience could be devastating to one person and totally not even on the radar of another person, and that they could be in the same exact experience. They might even experience it at the same time together and not have the same takeaway from it. And it has everything to do with the natural history that goes into a person's life, even in utero, the extent to which their mother was under duress or stressed while she was pregnant, the extent to which the family system is under duress when you come into the world and you're being taken care of by all these different individuals. They may not have the ability to um, form secure attachment with you. And so then, even what someone else might call a minor stressor or a chronic stressor is unbelievably affecting to your life, and it may have almost no impact on someone else. So the trauma measuring contest is not very helpful to people because it turns out we all experience these things at different magnitudes based on our natural history.
Yes, and I think who talks about a lot of what you just covered also is Robert Sapolsky. I think
Mm-hmm.
he touches a lot on this, and I think that's where he talks with a lot of really sound authority about the issue. His conclusions about it, I have issue with, but um, I completely agree with the background, the science behind that. And it's, you know, it's funny because what you mention is an incremental, I mean, this is incremental day in, day out trauma. Just
Mm-hmm.
your nervous system is under duress. Um, and your brain and your body are making adjustments to cope with that that stress, that constant stress. And they're using whatever tools they have to regulate itself. Um, that's it's kind of the heart of what we're talking about here. If this is incrementally where you're at, I can tell you from experience, it takes incremental change to get out of it. It's not
Yeah.
like you said, it isn't this. I can imagine, and I think it probably happened with me, where you have these moments where, oh, I let my guard down and I feel safe and vulnerable. Um, it's a very dangerous time, actually. It's extremely
Mm-hmm.
dangerous time because your network, who is ultimately, in polyvagal theory, your network of your connections, your primary, your partner, your best friends, the people that you've made healthy connections that have helped you kind of get out of this situation. You could make bad connections to bad people who are maybe equally as traumatized, if not more than you, bad
Mm-hmm.
actors who want to take advantage of you. I mean, there's a bunch of things where you could be vulnerable in this state. I felt very lucky that, I had my wife and, my support, my family, that I'd created my own little bubble of support there, because I was extremely vulnerable. I got into crypto after I stopped my addictions. When crypto yeah, it's scary when you get into crypto, when it's like in 2022, like the worst time to get into crypto. Anyways, I got into that shit for, I went down that rabbit hole for a couple months until my wife was like, "Hey, you're in free fall. You've got a gaping hole where your addiction took place, and now you're really raw." I was restructuring a lot of my family dynamic too during this period of time
Mm-hmm.
too, because I was having consequential arguments with my father that were became irreconcilable to the point where
Yeah.
we have not talked for years now. So
Mm-hmm.
all of that was happening. I was a lot of restructuring in my life happened during that year because I was extremely vulnerable, like you said. I didn't regress back into a full fear state because I had that healthy regulating family unit there to stop that from really from occurring. I think that had a lot to do with it. But incremental change, it's been years. Every day you're incrementally undoing 18 years plus whatever in utero happened, however time works in utero.
Mm-hmm.
Um, you're undoing that. That's what you're doing. That's what the battle against trauma and your past self is. Um, so
I would liken the idea of a chronically traumatic developmental experience to that of um, think of a small stream or rivulet. You know, a little water starts heading down a channel, and the channel begins to be cut away by the flow of water because of the erosion. And over time, and with maybe flash floods and a few other things, next thing you know, you've got a real trench. Next thing you know, you've got a torrent of water going through there, and you've got this chasm. And that is sort of analogous to the way that you can think about the nature of chronic complex trauma. And so by the time we're adults, that has turned into this thing that, like that gully or that washed out stream bed, it's got steep sides. There's not really plants growing on either side of it. You can't get down to it to maybe get a drink from the water. It's just this really gouged out feature. And so every time something happens that is just more water coming down that channel, it makes it worse. It doesn't make it better. It makes it more deeper, steeper, faster, more violent, all these things that make it a less pleasant scenario. And that's why it just doesn't we can't just, take our trauma out of our sack, lay it on the table and have someone compare theirs to it and say, see, mine's bigger. It doesn't work that way.
yeah, it's so funny you said that because I wrote in my book what about water and a system of levees that you
Mm-hmm.
basically build up, and how my addictions were I built behind series of levees and dams that were holding
Yep.
back tons of energy and taking up
Mm-hmm.
tons of time. And as water came in, if we're just saying
Mm-hmm.
water is the flow of time and
Yep.
energy, um, I was dedicating more and more to those dams. And when the video game one broke, I had already or I had let that water out. It had to go places, and
Mm-hmm.
it was
Mm-hmm.
devastating. As you can imagine, taking
Mm-hmm.
a dam out
Mm-hmm.
pretty suddenly, it washed away a lot of shit, if we're sticking with the analogy. And
Yep.
when you have all of this roaring uncontrollable river, and we've got banks that have eroded, and
Mm-hmm.
it's toppled cities and whatever, and new routes and rivers are being formed, the only thing you can do is you let it ride its course and you try to guide the periphery, and you start building small healthy locks and dikes and levees
Mm-hmm.
to route the water as you would a good hydro engineer. Unironically, maybe my work, it does dictate part of my analogies, but you know that it's incremental. You incrementally control the flow of water, you start to guide it, and ultimately, before you know it, you have a pretty well maintained water routeway system.
Mm-hmm.
We have these systems all over the American geography. We mastered waterways, being that we were so geographically gifted with so much river and so much water throughout our country. Um, it's doable. You can do it personally in your own life too. It's just, whew, it, you're not going to contain the huge river all at once. It's
Yep.
literally just like a tributary, a little stream that comes off. You start working on the little ones, and then you work your way up. So,
Well, and we'll take the analogy to its logical extreme, and that is you have to go upstream. You have to go up to where the headwaters are. You have to
The
go up to
source.
where the source is, and that is as far as I can take this metaphor before it really breaks to pieces. And that's, of course, what the therapeutic interventions I've been doing have created. That is what the um, ballroom dancing has provided. That's what the body of content of the authors and researchers and scientists and psychiatric doctors that we've read or talked about in this forum. All of this contributes to getting farther and farther upstream where the waters are more and more manageable. All right, so if I don't stop now, this thing will get totally out of hand. It'll become a hydrology
I don't
podcast.
know. Like, I'm sorry, but there are a lot. Like, You can't swim upstream by yourself. What
No,
you're
you can't.
saying is you needed a row team basically. Like these are
Hmm.
our conversations too are another input to that. You need all of these different systems of other living creatures, at least some
Yeah.
type of positive feedback that's going to help you. Even a dog will help you swim upstream, I guess, in this analogy. But yeah, you need these systems in place.
Let's
So
get back to the thought technology of
yes,
polyvagal theory. All right, so you got an introduction in, and I've got some things that I just went ahead and plagiarized from the Polyvagal Institute's website. So I'll talk about that here, so that I'm connecting with actual uh, evidential speech. So our neuroception scans other people, our own body, and the environment for cues of safety and danger. That's a major idea of how the autonomic nervous system works. Neuroception is a coinage from Dr. Stephen Porges. And it gets at the idea that we're using a bunch of sensory apparatus, both internal and external, to figure out what our relative signals of safety versus signals of threat are. As these cues come in, the nervous system reflexively and instantaneously shifts the autonomic state to manage the situation to optimize survival. And this is one of the key ideas. To be able to handle all of this, we have the intentional brain that we can use to interpret what's happening. Neuroception and autonomic state are intertwined. Although neuroception is a powerful mechanism capable of shifting autonomic state, it is dependent upon the individual's current autonomic state and historical flexibility to move back and forth among states. There's a concept that we can talk about either in industrial automation or in the human body, and that is states become traits. And they happen either just sort of automatically because of our exposure to an environment, or they can happen intentionally because we intervene. And I brought this up earlier in the conversation about our flexibility to move in between these states. A more resilient individual will have a neuroception biased towards detecting cues of safety, while a less resilient individual will have a neuroception biased towards detecting threat. And so the essence of our autonomic nervous system in whatever post-traumatic existence we're living in is that latter part. It's always looking for threat. That's why um, ambiguous interactions with other people can seem more negative than they actually were. It's why driving in traffic can feel like such a nightmare to people like myself. It's why we might shut out people from our family systems or social networks that just always expose these these threat signals, whether they
and
were there.
and on a deeper level, it's also why you're more tired. You're more tired. You are
Yeah.
in a mental fog. You Everything is harder
Hmm.
a little bit. It might not be a lot. It might even not be noticeable with certain things you like to do. It's not as hard as but it's harder than if your brain isn't always looking for threat. And I don't need to be a biologist to understand this. Like when you're releasing a lot of cortisol
Hmm.
and stress hormones and adrenaline and all of these things, if you've released a bunch of adrenaline, if you've ever gone through something that's gotten you excited, and then that post adrenaline dump is exhaustion follows that,
Yeah.
right? Like, so you can imagine if you've been at this state elevated all the time, or this is just your baseline, your state has become your trait, then, and maybe we're touching on something that you've experienced but you never really thought about. It's this mental fog. It's this feeling of invisible weight on your shoulders. You could work out, but you're just tired to start working out. You're tired after you work out. You work out regularly and you're still just, it's rough. You don't have the energy. It never feels like it's there. Like all of that can be part, like a subsequently part that you're describing that I think I want to touch on because I felt it. I felt exactly that feeling. And I felt what it
The,
feels like after it's gone.
yeah, totally. The ideal post-adrenal spike is supposed to be a rest, recovery, and co-regulation state. That would be the ideal outcome. For some reason, we have a HPA axis activation state. We deal with something, whatever it is, and then as soon as it's over with, we go back into co-regulation and pro-social engagement. And if that were the case for us, if that had been the pattern throughout our lives, you and I would have a very boring discussion today. We wouldn't be talking about anything meaningful because we would just be handling everything with this equanimity that just defined our lives. It would be the state of our lives, and
Well,
that's
we'd
not the
probably
case.
be talking about like more engineering and science and
Right.
geopolitics, like that kind of stuff. Stuff we'll eventually hopefully talk about at some point, but we're in this now, people. We're in the middle of our addiction series, and it's happening. And we're in the heavy stuff. We're not going to start off light.
This could be just become a fan podcast of the book Eager that talks about beavers.
I would love that because beavers are fascinating to me. Being
Yeah,
maybe I'm
totally.
biased because we're from Oregon and
Yeah.
we have a little bit of bias there, but yeah.
All right, let me get back to this. So neuroception is biased, excuse me. Neuroception is biased towards detecting threat when the ANS is in a state of defense, either dominated by the sympathetic nervous system supporting fight flight or the dorsal vagal pathway supporting immobilization. When in a calm state, dominated by ventral vagal, that's the front side of the vagus nerve, and the social engagement systems, neuroception is less likely to reactively trigger defensive states and behaviors. That sounds like a bunch of technobabble soup. Literally, all this is saying is that a state of sympathetic activation. So let's say I like to bring up this thing that we'll just talk about is being in the car driving. I'm sympathetically activated. You really got to be. You got to be ready for something to happen on the road. In that state, I am, if not 100%, very highly percentage more likely to interpret everything around me as a threat condition or as a threat to me. I'm not going to interpret anyone else's behavior as being anything other than hostile at a minimum. And so that's a quality of the ANS. It is, if it's tuned towards threat detection, it biases toward threat detection. Consequently, if the dorsal vagal state, which is a shutdown and dissociation under duress, then you're going to be biased towards seeing things as significantly horrible enough that shutting down is the only answer. And so it's only during the co-regulated experience where we are ventral vagal active that we can better interpret signals from our environment and signals from the body as signals of safety. That's a big idea with polyvagal. If our neuroception is faulty, it sends a signal of danger when we're actually safe. So this is that paradox I was talking about earlier. Or it sends a signal of safety when we're actually in danger, which is a less usual, but that comes up. Faulty
Fighters,
neuroception. Hmm?
fighters who do it for a living.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean,
They're
that
they're
would
in
be
a,
my
they're
first
going to be in
guess.
a maybe a more relaxed posture. Not relaxed is the wrong terminology, but they're going to experience the they're very experienced. They're going to experience getting into the ring and getting into the match as something approaching like their workday, as opposed to what it might be to you and I if we're just pushed into a ring as, oh, this is actually really upsetting and not what I had in mind.
No, I'm
So that
terrible at
doesn't feel
that.
like work.
I'm really
Yeah.
good at absorbing a punch, as is evident by this crooked nose.
I would say it's one of your handsome characteristics, Pierce.
Thanks. I've been pissing off enough people to make it so, I guess, throughout my life.
All
One of
right.
them was from
So
basketball. I mean, it was just, that stray elbow coming around too. So,
sure, of course.
not just
You
out
know,
brawling people left and right.
you don't get through so many decades on the planet without a few scratches.
Yeah, that's true.
Okay, so individuals with a history of severe adversity may find themselves habitually hypervigilant in anticipation of threats. Ding, 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 it's me. In addition, to optimize the detection of risk and the preparation for defense, they might, this is also very interesting and a paradox, seek out risky behavior to ensure that their autonomic state remains in a chronic state, that their autonomic nervous system remains in a chronic state of heightened sympathetic arousal. So I just said that according to polyvagal theory, people who are sufficiently traumatized will look for situations to stay in that activated sympathetic state because it affirms their suspicion about the world. And they're already prepared to confront it. So it validates all of this energy they're dumping into their physiological condition to handle threats.
Yeah, so what a oh God, the fact that our podcast is called Confidently Uncertain is so funny because of what you just said there.
Mm-hmm.
Because it it's a natural, I think it's just so core or intrinsic to survival for us to need to generally be right, right? Like you generally want to be right because that's how you know you're staying safe. And if you're in a
Yeah.
heightened state of your HPA axis is completely activated, you're in this heightened state of fear all the time. Your sympathetic nervous system is activated all the time into this state, then you would seek out confirmation to be like, wait, hold on, like I'm expending tons of energy
Mm-hmm.
daily, just existing in my life, going about my
Mm-hmm.
day to day, having to go to work. I have to get all ramped up, and all this has to happen. Um, I need to make sure that this is all worth it. Like it's you do need. I could imagine having to validate this
Yeah.
constantly, right? And it's funny too. It reminds me of people who are like, oh, I'm a truth-seeking person. Like I seek truth, and really they're looking for something that more validates their opinion a lot of times than
Yeah.
seeking like the actual truth about something. Um, I'm reminded of that specifically, that instinct to seek truth, but really to seek validation more than anything. And I think that's an intrinsic human trait. It's probably tied to our survival. Um,
Mm-hmm.
you know,
Well, I would reflect it back to the idea that we use stories as a modality and mechanism for describing to our to um, our level of consciousness and our cognition what's going on with the world, and we could come up with a story that kind of fits the situation but doesn't perfectly. But depending on any number of different influential factors, if that story is off a little bit, we might actually double down to make sure that it is confirmed by evidence. And look no further than our most recent history about anything that happened post March of 2020. There's dozens and dozens and dozens of examples of the American public and the um, you know human beings
scientific
around the
community.
world just just really struggling with this idea of uncertainty around this new thing. and how absolutely dysregulating it was. And in the book, Our Polyvagal World, the authors get into this. They talk about just the complexity of the damage that the pandemic caused to humanity. And it's not gone. We haven't just resolved it because we went back to a posture of being social and unmasked. It's still there.
Oh,
So the next thing I want to bring up to quickly transition, so I can I a few more things I want to address here, and that is that we've talked about the sympathetic and aroused state quite a bit. So you might think about the yellow. This is the yellow band in that plot that Pierce might put up as a graphic for this section of the conversation,
I
and
will.
it's pretty useful. It's fight or flight. It's also if if we're socially engaged and we're in an elevated state, we might be playing a sport, we might be rock climbing, we might be, maybe riding our motorcycle and with everybody else with the same jacket on. It could be any number of things like that. So it isn't just threaten and danger. It could just also be that we're doing something that requires a lot of elevated nervous system interaction and energy consumption. The red state, the red condition that plot describes, is what I'm going to talk about next. The polyvagal theory also explains why some victims do not run away or resist in the presence of abuse or violence. Their nervous systems switch to the dorsal vagal response of numbing or immobilization for survival, instead of the sympathetic response of fight or flight. For the trauma survivor, the nervous system has become fixed in the sympathetic or dorsal state without returning to the ventral state. This is so profoundly important that the English language is impoverished as a means of communicating this idea. And one of the most important concepts that this plays into is that of in the role of uh, uh, sexual assault victims. In a very disproportionate number of sexual assault, the people who suffer uh, from these assaults have a history that sets them up for this. It is a history that is traumatic, and it is a history where they were driven into dorsal vagal states by their attackers throughout time, which ensures that they remain easy victims for everyone else that comes after that first and second and third initial attack. And so there have been court cases and public discourse and any number of other examples where people who do not understand this will make the claim that if something was traumatizing, why didn't the person just leave or fight back or do something to come to their own defense? And it turns out that's not how our nervous system works. Our nervous system, when put into a state of parasympathetic threat, where we detect threats so overwhelming that we cannot avoid them or escape them or fight back, we default into this dissociative and shut down state. It is literally the most normal and totally adaptive quality of our nervous system. And because we refuse to understand it, we implicate people's volitional involvement in things that are harming them. And that's not the truth.
So I have a question. You might
Mm-hmm.
not know the answer to this, but I was just curious. For this scenario you've laid out, which is an extremely common scenario, and
Yeah.
I can think of a couple of my guy friends who have gone through this
Mm-hmm.
actually, and probably some of my girl friends and acquaintances that I've met, I'm sure. Um, but when this happens, to can this happen from not being molested or raped at first too? Like, what all can cause this freeze response? When does it develop in the brain? Is it early? Like, would a 0 to 4 year old experience this
Yeah.
feeling where because where they without being molested, or is it very tied to something severe like that level of violence? Or I'm just curious because I'm thinking of one of my friends who I was molested when he was a teenager, and I was wondering if he went through the freeze response, or if that happened afterwards, or like had something happen to him earlier, which kind of had made him a victim that wasn't molested related, that had set him up to be a victim of it in his teenage years. I was just curious, like,
Yeah,
is there
I have the
anything?
world's most unsatisfactory answer to your question, and
Yeah.
here it is. And that is that the dorsal vagal state is the most primitive of our nervous system responses to threat. So what I mean by that, and what the polyvagal theory describes, and what Stephen Porges will tell you on every interview that you listen to him talk about this, he says that the more lethal we interpret a situation to be, the much more primitive our nervous system will respond with behaviors. So in a in a scenario where, let's say, a reptile, even a modern reptile that we can observe with our own eyes, in a scenario where a modern reptile is presented with a dangerous situation, it is its responses to these threats really defaults to things like freezing because it you know it only has so much energy to dispense into fleeing. They don't really cold-blooded creatures can't they don't work the way that we do from an energy consumption standpoint. So they can fight a little bit, they can run a little bit,
Hurry up and wait.
but really what they can do is just shut down and prepare for the end because it's kind of inevitable for them because of the way that their biology is structured. So I said that's going to be just the most unsatisfactory answer to your question. What we can imagine then is that the natural history of a person's life is going to bias them towards these dorsal vagal dissociative and shutdown behaviors because of um, a fracture in the attachment system early on. So it could be any number of things that we would not immediately characterize as capital T trauma, but because of a so the attachment theory is something that I have in my I don't know if I mentioned it today. So Pierce and I have kind of a working document for talking about these topics. I put together my 7 working theories or working models for talking about trauma. And one of the 7 models is attachment theory. And so attachment theory was created in the mid 20th century, and first you had securely attached and unsecurely attached, and then people figured out that there were sort of degrees of unsecure attachment, and they divided up into these different structures. And so insecure attachment can be the basis for a freeze response in someone as a product of their natural history. And that can happen because of the way that the connections with the caregivers were immediately made early on, or it can happen because of a chronic fracture in attachment and co-regulation in early childhood, or it can happen because something takes place in later childhood and early adolescence that causes a person to need to revert back to this dorsal vagal shutdown state.
So
So
that could be
hopefully that,
simple as being abandoned on a
yes.
daily basis, by
Mm-hmm.
the adult or your caregivers if they're not meeting your normal needs, and every time that the child is looking for a caregiver or an adult, there's no one there to be found. That
Yeah.
repeated, just something as simple as not being there could fracture that, and cause somebody to freeze potentially. Then it sounds like. Um,
I identify closely with the avoidant attachment model of uh, attachment failure or fracture in attachment. I identify with the avoidant style,
mhm.
and avoidant style fits the. See, these are all theories, so if I say it fits this shutdown version better, well, it has a lot to do with my lived experience of it. I'm much more likely to not call out or not try to attach because of those fractures of attachment early on. And that's translated into the way that my friendships wither on the vine. It's translated into the way that you know, my marriage ended because I just lacked the understanding of what was going on. One, two, the default behavior for me is to hide,
Yeah.
to dissociate,
Well,
to disconnect.
calling out would be calling to danger to come to you. Essentially,
Exactly.
that's like, I mean, you were like, why would I announce where I'm
Yeah.
at when I'm not going to call somebody to my aid? You know, yeah. So that totally tracks,
Mm-hmm.
as far as behavior goes. Yeah. God, just an hour just sneaks up on us like one of you guys. I have to say, it's crazy how time flies when you're talking about polyvagal theory. Um, well, I think we're gonna have to just cut this off and start right back up again. I don't know what kind of time you have left, on, as far as schedule wise. You got another one left in you?
I actually do, but we kind of covered everything that I wanted to get to on polyvagal theory. The last slide
Good.
that I had to get to it talked about co-regulation, but we've already covered that kind of out of order. So,
Awesome.
you know, we can get on to some other topic entirely after this.
I like that. All right. Well, hey everybody, we're going to go ahead and call this episode. I think we're at the hour marker, so uh, we're going to sign off, and then hopefully we'll have another one of these coming right up for you. A different topic, needless to say. So, yeah, Richard. On that, I'm going to go ahead and say sign off and say have a good one.
All right, partner. Signing off for now.